Hi guys, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the decade before the Civil War begins. If you remember in our last video, we talked about the Compromise of 1850. And I said this really lays the groundwork for what we're going to see in the future, which is more conflict over slavery, more conflict over its expansion, and how we're really going to piece this nation together that has really been fractured and broken due to sectionalism. And if you remember, sectionalism is that idea that you identify more with a section of the country rather than you do a political party or an ideology. And so for today in your notes, you need to list this as Decade of Crisis Part 1. And remember that everything we're going to talk about from here on out is from 1850 to 1860. We will start with the Compromise of 1850. We'll pick up where we left off from there, and then we will end with the election of Abraham Lincoln. And so no discussion really about the North and the South and the precursor to the Civil War is complete without really talking about how Northern societies versus Southern societies felt about slavery itself. And we've talked kind of at length already about what Southern society is like. Remember, we talked about kind of the social triangle and where everybody fits in there. We've also talked about things like how large plantation owners have developed their whole society around getting people to do their work for them. But what is it like in the North? Well, for instance, the North is not particularly in love with the idea of slavery. Many people are abolitionists, but that does not mean that they want these individuals, these former slaves, to be freed and then moved to the North. Many of them are in favor of repatriation back to Africa, and what that means is they want to send them back to another country and let them create their own country instead of bringing them to the North. Now, if you remember when we left off the Compromise of 1850, one of the things that it does for the Southerners, some of the red meat that it gives them, is it strengthens the fugitive slave laws. And this opens up a giant can of worms for individuals. Slaves that escaped from the North had to be now by law returned to the South. There was a reward for their return, and as a result, a new profession opens up, somebody known as a slave catcher. Now, their job is to literally go around and pull people out who had been runaway slaves. Because remember, running away was very costly to the plantation owners, because they had to now either buy a new slave, or they had to train that person again, or they had to go out and try to bring them back and pay this ransom and this reward. So a lot of slave catchers a lot of people get into the job of slave catching at this time because it's really lucrative. You can make a lot of money doing this. As a result, you get some very nefarious individuals who get involved in this, and they end up often capturing free African Americans in the North and claiming that they are slaves, kidnapping them and bringing them back to the South, and rather than returning them to a slave master who would claim them, more often than not what they would do is they would just sell them into slavery and make that money back and then say, they were escaped slaves. That's actually the story of Solomon Northup, who wrote a book about his time in captivity called 12 Years a Slave. He was born a free man. He is kidnapped one night while meeting with a few gentlemen about a business proposition. He is taken southward, and he spends the next 12 years of his life in bondage until, luckily, once somebody recognizes that he's a free man and can prove that for him. This happens time and time again. There's a book about this that he wrote himself, and there's also a movie that came out a few years ago. It's actually really, really good. Judges were often paid to rule in favor of the slaveholders when somebody was accused of either running away or of being not really being a slave. They brought this to court, and anyone who tried to help an escaped slave was fined up to $10,000 and could see as much as 6 months in jail. So there's no real there's not really any leeway here. If you are helping somebody, you run the risk of both personal and financial ruin for doing that. Now, over 300 slaves were returned, we believe, roughly, but thousands. But the thing that really is big about this is, yes, this is an awful situation, but what it really does is, probably no more than any other thing, is it gets Northerners off the fence, finally. It makes many of them abolitionists overnight, because what they saw before was, well, listen, we don't love slavery and we don't like it here, but it's not that big of a deal to us. If these people make it to the North, they should be free. Now it's saying, if we even help them, we run the risk of being in trouble. And so for a lot of people, this makes them say, we can't agree with this institution of slavery anymore. So if the fugitive slave laws of the 1850s are what makes more people abolitionists, Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, is probably the things that literally almost loads the weapons of war in the future. It's written in 1852 by this lady, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She's a wife of a preacher. She's the sister of a preacher. She's the daughter of a preacher. As you can imagine, she's a pretty devout woman. And she is concerned about the tragedy and suffering that she sees around her. Her 18-month-old son died. Her brother had been murdered. And she saw all of this death and this sadness as almost punishment for slavery. She thought God was actually reaching out and punishing America for this. And so she thought there was no way they could ever see an end to this slavery or see an end to this suffering until slavery was abolished. Almost like the big biblical plagues of the Old Testament from Exodus, where if you remember, Moses is leading his people to freedom, and God gives these plagues, right? She saw the exact same thing. She was such a devout woman. So she writes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's about a kind a man who is in slavery named Uncle Tom, right? He has a benevolent, kind slave master who then has to sell him into slavery, to sell him to another slave owner, who is not quite so nice. And it's the tale of what happens to Tom and other slaves that as they go through life. And it really rallies people to the cause. 5,000 copies are sold in just 2 days. 300,000 copies are sold in 1 year. And Abraham Lincoln will famously say, it's the thing that she's the little woman who started this war. So the beauty about Harriet Beecher Stowe's book is that it is expert propaganda. Everything in it is exaggerated. And that's not to say that none of it is true, but that is to say that she knows how to really tug at the heartstrings. And we'll read a little bit of some excerpts from this book in class. And so you'll see exactly how she's able to really well up this emotion in people. But she showed that even good people were involved in slavery, that it wasn't just something that an evil, nefarious person had done. I mean, even Tom's kind and benevolent slave master, who treated him as almost one of the family, is still involved in slavery. And that when he hits hard times, he has to abide by the same system as everybody else. It showed how slavery damaged families, how it separated them at slave auctions and when people had to be sold off. As you can imagine, Southerners hated the book, and many of them wrote their own books to try to disprove Harriet Beecher Stowe and wrote about kind of the paternal system and how wonderful slavery was and how people were kind and nice to their slaves. But as you can tell, this book really does make people start kind of thinking differently about slavery. If you were a Northerner, if you were somebody who was on the fence about abolition, you read this book and it outraged you. It is really a perfect piece of propaganda. And so that's it. That's all you need for the notes today. Make sure you have them have all this information in your notes. Any questions you have, make sure you add those to your notes as well so we can talk about them in class. We'll go over all of this again tomorrow. We'll actually read some excerpts of Harriet Beecher Stowe's book. But the main things to remember is you can start now to see. We've done the compromise, the Missouri Compromise. We've done the Compromise of 1850. We had the Fugitive Slave Act strengthening, right? Now you've got Harriet Beecher Stowe's book. You're starting to see slavery come to the forefront as a major issue in America. Remember, Jefferson was concerned all the way back in 1820 about this fractured union that he saw developing, and you're starting to really see that now. Sectional divides are becoming much more important. Until next time, have a great rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.